Welcome to the Elijah Rising podcast. Elijah Rising is an organization empowering women recovering from sexual exploitation. This episode is going to help you become more aware about the issue of sex trafficking and inspire you to take action.
Hey, welcome back to the podcast. If you haven't already, go ahead and like and subscribe so that more people can access this important content. And today, I am joined on the podcast by David Gamboa, the Director of Communications here at Elijah Rising. Welcome back to the podcast, David.
You know, thanks for having me. I will say it's a little terrifying being on this side of the camera because I'm so used to just watching and listening.
David is normally right behind that lens. And so he's our producer extraordinaire and does all things production. But today we've got you on the podcast. And so why don't we just go ahead and set the context? What are we doing today?
We're going to talk about some trafficking cases that were in the news recently, specifically targeting Houston.
Yeah.
And when I started at Elijah Rising, I had no experience in this anti-trafficking space. I literally came from a bubble. I had no idea this existed.
Yeah.
My first job was to create social media posts. And
for Elijah Rising,
Elijah Rising, yeah. And one of the first things I started doing was it's called online listening.
Okay.
And so there are these tools that you can listen for things online. And whenever people post or mention Elijah Rising or Adam Cheney or David or Houston sex trafficking, I'll get an email and it shows me all these topics that were being brought up.
So whether that's
sites or Twitter.
Exactly. Yeah. Somewhere on the website or on the web somewhere it's popping up and you're getting a notification because of it.
Yeah. So I read these regularly. And, over the course of 4 years, I began to notice and learn from things and from doing intervention, just begin to see some of these things that we'll talk about in this case.
Sure.
But I by no means am I an expert, but I am a concerned citizen.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of what I want to help our audience step into.
Yeah.
Becoming aware of what's happening in our city. It's in the news. We just kind of often scroll past it or we'll share it and not think about it ever again.
Right.
But these are things that we need to be thinking about, learning, how this problem is continuing to grow and what it looks like in our communities.
Yeah, that's great. And so that's what we're going to discuss today is how to be a more informed citizen. And so kind of what we're going to do is a little bit different today on the podcast than our normal kind of structure. So as David has mentioned, he had a couple of news stories that have popped up. And so I'm just going to give a brief of the first one and then we'll dive into it. Okay.
Let's do it.
So according to a criminal complaint filed on March 30th, the Houston family, Maria Botello and her 2 adult children and a nephew are accused of coordinating a sex trafficking operation in which the family forced women to be waitresses in their bar, and the name of that bar was Porto Alegre here in Houston, to perform sex acts on customers. The complaint states that Maria would coordinate dates with clients who paid $70 for every 15 minutes with the women. Her son and her nephew were and the report says, quote unquote, the enforcers who used weapons, threats, and intimidation to keep the women compliant, and some of whom were minor children. Authorities also identified another victim who was brought to the United States specifically to work at that bar when she was 17 years old, according to the same complaint. While she was there, she was allegedly forced to engage in commercial sex acts. Now, if convicted, the family members each face a minimum of 10 years, but in this case in particular, they could face up to life in federal prison. So that's the first story we want to kind of think through and talk about. So this is, we are not strangers to this bar.
Absolutely.
This is not the first time we've heard of this location. This was a place that was on our van tour, one of the iterations of our former awareness van tour, which we're working on kind of revamping that in this period that COVID has caused it to shut down. So this was a number of years ago. But why do you think, if we knew about it back then, why do you think it has taken this long for this bar in particular to be shut down?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it was on the van tour even before I became a part of Elijah. Like,
it's been years.
Honestly, didn't even go to that iteration of the van tour because I think y'all used to go Galleria area and then go
down into the ship channel. Yeah, exactly.
But I did, when I first began to volunteer, I went on intervention and I was just kind of placed on the Cantina team with, limited experience. But as I began to go, this was one of the places that we went to frequently.
Yeah.
And it was shocking to me because, we'd walk in and there would be just tons of girls everywhere.
Yeah. And it's not that big of a building.
No, it's very small.
For context. Yeah, right.
It's very small. And, I would just go there and I would sit at the bar and I would strike up a conversation and I would just listen.
Yeah.
And people would just tell you their stories of how they got there and what was difficult with doing intervention is there was one time where this wasn't at this place, but it was a place that was right next door to it.
Yeah, because that's a good point too there, David, is like in some of these locations where especially the Cantina trade is operating, you will have multiple bars that operate almost identically, but you'll have like 4 or 5 on the same street. So anyways, go ahead.
Yeah, so on this, like for this street example, there's probably 4 on the same like corner.
Right.
And they all are the same type of, it's a bar, you walk in, there's women, and they sell beers and all that. Cash only.
Right.
But we go to one of those that's next door, and we notice a young girl. We weren't able to approach her. People kept protecting her. She just looked like sick, and she was at the bar sipping Gatorade, which I thought was strange.
Interesting. Yeah. Stood out to you.
Yeah. So we just had a feeling like this is someone like that's a minor that shouldn't be here. And so we did call law enforcement, and they came, and they weren't able to find the girl.
Wow.
We called them, they came, and they searched the whole place, went through the back kitchen, and couldn't find her.
Yeah.
And so that was when I began to realize like the challenge that law enforcement faces with shutting these places down.
Yeah.
And even, as Elijah Rising, our whole mission of intervention isn't necessarily to go shut these places down.
Right.
Because we wouldn't be welcome in those places. So it's a kind of a weird line to walk because we want to provide resources to the women.
Right.
And we want to do it in a way that's safe.
Yeah.
And we want to do it in a way where we go in and, we're not seen as a threat to everybody in there. Now, it's not our mission. We're not, law enforcement. We're not some, Navy SEAL.
Yeah, we don't even have, you make a great
weapons,
point. Right. We don't have the means nor the authority in most cases to, walk in, kick the door in and shut it down, right? That's not what we're doing. Yeah.
Yeah, and people know that we're there, that we're with the church. So it's not like we are undercover posing as people. Like, people know we're there to provide resources.
Sure.
We don't try and hide that. And, there's cameras at these places, so people know you're coming, like, the second that you turn on the road, they know who's there. Yeah. They know if you're not a typical customer, a regular.
Yeah.
And so, and it takes time for like law enforcement to build a case.
Sure.
So we can provide tips, which we have before. We've noticed things at cantinas. Like one time we noticed a jukebox, and you could actually scroll through the jukebox, and it was different women's pictures.
Yeah.
And so, we took a picture of that and sent it.
Yeah.
We've made other kind of.
Well, I mean, even the story you just shared, I mean, you noticed someone who looked to be a minor, and you went outside and called the police and waited, and unfortunately in that case, they obviously moved that woman somewhere else, or that child, I should say, somewhere else.
Child.
So what does this case, this one in particular, show you about other cantinas in Houston? Like, what does it reveal to you? What does it make you think about, when not just for Porto Alegre, but for the whole kind of that typology of trafficking in our city.
Yeah, well, it's very easy to walk in one of these places and just think, well, this is a bar. You know, there's no trafficking happening here.
Sure.
But when you begin to see, you know, like with this case where they use weapons, threats, intimidation to keep the women compliant, they had like rules and procedures for how to operate this sex trafficking operation. You know, that tells me that the places that we do visit, the odds are very likely that this same thing is going on.
Sure. Yeah.
In those, I mean, if you, they all probably know each other.
Yeah.
Surely, you know.
Yeah.
If you're a business and you work next door to another business, odds are you know the people across the street.
Yeah.
And so this just shows us that, you know, these bars aren't safe places.
Right.
In this particular case, it's saying that there was a 17-year-old that was actually brought from another country,
right,
specifically to
work. Yeah, at that
this place,
at that one location. Yeah. So, I guess, you know, why then is it important for? It makes sense for you to know about this. Like it makes a lot of sense for you to be well informed and for you to understand how these places operate, especially for us, you know, at Elijah Rising. Like it is our job, right, to go into these places, to do intervention, to offer those resources. But why is it important for the average citizen to understand? Why is it important for someone watching us right now on the camera or listening in their car right now, driving down 610 somewhere, to understand how these places operate and how difficult it is to, disrupt them?
I would say the reason why these places are still open is because not enough people care.
Wow.
We look at, you know, high-profile cases like Jeffrey Epstein, where everyone in the United States, maybe even the world, would say this man did atrocious things and that is unacceptable.
Right.
Well, those same things are happening in our city, and we've just kind of turned a blind eye to it, or maybe we literally are just, we don't know. Like, you know, we live in bubbles. Like, I'll admit, I was a youth pastor, so my bubble was the church world. Like, you would never find me in a cantina until I went on intervention. And once I stepped out of that bubble, I began to realize, like, wow, there are these situations and these circumstances and these trafficking operations that are happening right here in our communities. And if we all don't do our job of help bringing this to the light, it's just going to be, you know, another news story, another statistic. Well, Houston's going to continue to have these. Well, it's another sex trafficking bust happens where, and you know, previously Houston has had some big headlines where more than 50 women were, you know, found in these places, these cantinas. Historically, I think criminals are innovative.
Sure.
And so one of the things we've been seeing is like there's not as many women in the places. They move them around to kind of just blend in with other business. Like just, you know, this is just a bar. It's not a trafficking operation. But I think if more people cared and more people saw this 17-year-old as a child.
Great point.
And even the women there, to see them, like, this could have been, I mean, it could mean life or death for them or their families. You know, there's violence and threats made on their families back in other countries.
Well, and that's the thing too. Like, we actually don't know, right? I mean, this place was operating. This family was operating for, years and years.
More than 10 years.
More than 10 years, right? I mean, and we've been aware of it, and law enforcement has been aware of it for a long time. And you made a great point. Like, it takes a while to get these cases going and get enough evidence. But like, I guess the point that I'm trying to make is like, we actually don't know the extent to which the injustice has affected how many lives, right? I mean, there's just untold stories.
Yeah, in fact, right now they're even asking for victims to come forward because they know that there's much more. Yeah,
great point there too, David. This story just broke in March, but they actually haven't been convicted of anything yet. So, I mean, there are certain instances and certain cases where without, I think, the public support and public outcry, and without good judges and good DAs and good prosecutors, people like this family can just go away.
Yeah, and I will say one thing I've noticed is, if you have a Netflix account, Narcos is a big TV show on there that highlights cartels like the Medellin cartel, and cartels in Mexico, and it's almost become just kind of like a voyeuristic obsession with this kind of criminal underground, and it's kind of glorified that culture.
Yeah.
But the truth is, it's really, really happening in our city, affecting real women, affecting real children, and men.
That is such a good point too. Like, because I'm a fan of the show too, right? Like,
well, I watched it.
Yeah. But that first season, it's like you kind of fall in love with Pablo a little bit, right? And it's like, wait, he blew up an airliner, right? Like,
it's the storytelling and the way that cinematographers. Storytelling is so powerful.
Yeah,
it can make you glorify things that maybe
in your normal life you wouldn't glorify.
Yeah.
And I think your point there, though, is like this is not just a problem for Medellin in Colombia.
Yeah,
like this problem is here. It's not just over there. It's not just some other country or some other place's problem.
Yeah, and I think we fall into a trap because we say, "Oh, well, that happens in Mexico."
Right.
But the market is here.
Yeah, great point.
The market is Houston. The market is California, United States.
Yeah.
Like we're providing this market where criminals can bring human beings over to be purchased. So we're as much of the problem. And
it's basic economics, right? Supply and demand.
Yeah.
There's a demand, thus there is a supply. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. We're going to take a break in the podcast, but when we come back on the other side, we're going to look at one more recent story that's been in the news with a Houston connection. So we'll see you on the other side. Take a second and think about how many subscription services you have. Netflix, Hulu, Spotify. If you're like me, you have more than you actually use. That money just disappears out of your bank account, or maybe you don't even use the product anymore. So why not donate that same amount of money to Elijah Rising and know that every dollar you spend directly serves those who are overcoming sex trafficking? We invite you to join The Rise. The Rise is a dedicated community of recurring donors who give strategically to fund the work of ending sex trafficking. Join our community of more than 200 members who have decided to rise up. $10 a month can provide services for women seeking to exit exploitation. $40 a month can provide job training and employment for an overcomer of trafficking. Donate online via credit card, debit, ACH, or Apple and Google Pay at elijahrising.org/rise. Hey, welcome back. All right, let's dive into this next story, David. On April 26, 2021, so just recently from the point in which we're filming, 30-year-old Luis de Jesus Rodriguez, a.k.a. H-Town Hunter, a bounty hunter of sorts, pled guilty and was convicted of sex trafficking, conspiracy to commit visa fraud, and international money laundering, according to acting U.S. Attorney Jennifer B. Lowry, and he was sentenced to 180 months in federal prison for leading an international sex trafficking ring. Now, what's interesting about this story is in 2016, Rodriguez and his international criminal network targeted, recruited, and exploited young women in Colombia and in the United States by making false promises of a better life. Now, that we hear often in these cases, but Rodriguez directed them. This is what is unique, I think, in this one. Rodriguez directed them to watch YouTube videos of himself portraying him as a bounty hunter in order to assure the women that he was affiliated with law enforcement and could be trusted by them. Now, however, once here, the women had to work at Chicas Locas, another cantina here in Houston, or strip club, a strip club here in Houston. And Rodriguez and others forced the victims to sign debt bondage contracts with debts ranging anywhere from $13,000 to $25,000. And they also, the victims had to make daily payments of approximately $250. And if you can only imagine I mean, a day, $250 a day. It adds up, and most days you're not able to meet that quota, or whatever the case. Yeah. So what do you think? What's your reaction to the story, and what can we learn from it?
Well, I think like you brought up the YouTube videos. You mentioned that, and for me, when I first got involved with this, I really an obstacle for me in understanding the issue was, well, how do people get manipulated into doing something like this?
Yeah, good question.
And I began to, I watched his videos.
Yeah, we did go to YouTube and we did take a look at them. Yeah,
and I realized, if you were in a vulnerable position, like let's say, you didn't have a car and you needed to get to work, and all of a sudden someone comes around and says, "Hey, I have this car for you."
Yeah.
It's like, you might think, well, that's a little too good to be true, but because you need that, you want to trust. Our natural inclination is to trust people.
Sure.
And most people don't become in contact with people that are out to hurt them.
Yeah, great point.
All the time, but it's very true that you can't really trust anyone.
And
you don't know.
And you're like, everybody lives with this set of vulnerabilities, right?
Yeah.
And so you make a great point about, like, if you're needing a vehicle and somebody says, you're a trusting person or whatever, and somebody says, "Hey, I've got a vehicle for you." First of all, you're inclined to trust them. Second of all, right, and you don't expect them to exploit you. And second of all, someone is intentionally and strategically exploiting a vulnerability that you have, which makes you more inclined to say yes or end up in some exploitative relationship.
Yeah, and this person is also exploiting, women from another country.
Yeah.
And so he's posing with law enforcement. And so if you're in Colombia, you think, well, this guy must be safe because, here he is. One of the videos, he's actually in a school with children. With young children, and I'm sure seeing that video for someone could develop some level of trust.
Sure,
and
the people who take care of those kids,
obviously trusted him to
let him in,
come in and film this video.
Yeah. And I think in those videos, he's wearing a uniform. He's got on a Kevlar vest,
like posters. He's signing signatures.
Yeah,
he was actually on the news. I think it was a local news station actually interviewed this guy, and he has it on his YouTube channel. So that's another social kind of proof that these victims saw that and they trusted this person.
Yeah. And so I guess, like, is that unique? I mean, I said, kind of as I ran through the story, like, that's kind of unique. But I do wonder, like, are there other traffickers who are using social props to manipulate women into sex trafficking, or posing as law enforcement or whatever the case?
Yeah, I'm absolutely. I think.
Yeah.
I can't speak because I'm not an expert, but even I have sat in on a court trial that was alleging this club as
same one
having prostitution, trafficking, specifically Colombian women.
Yeah.
And in the trial, we saw pictures of women being brought in. We saw text messages. We saw rap sheets. We heard audio from undercover officers.
Yeah. So all sorts of evidence pointing to the fact that this club was facilitating trafficking.
Yeah. And with that case, it basically just kind of fell off the radar. And what was interesting, what I learned from that is we went to that case and one of the attorneys approached us and they were like, "Why are you guys here?" We're like, "Well, we're Elijah Rising. We fight trafficking. We're doing this blog, and we really want some details on this case so that we can write about it." And she basically wrote us this long email later because she was like, "Nobody cares about these trafficking cases that are being in court. Like, there's no news here most of the time. Most of the women." Primarily women trafficked from Asian or Central South American countries. She was like, they're treated like less than human in our courts, and no one is here to write about it and let the public know, basically.
Yeah, wow.
And
that, what stands out to me about that, David, is this kind of just hit me. Like, even in this story, like, we're very thankful that this individual was caught, right? And hopefully, I mean, he was convicted and sentenced 180 months. But where are the victims? Like, where are the women that he lied to, forced, frauded, and coerced into trafficking. I don't know. I mean, and the source that I was reading from is the state, the State Department's website, because he committed federal crimes. But to that lawyer's point, to you that day, nobody really focuses on the women.
Yeah,
right?
and it is I think it's a challenge because, if you want to build a case, you have to have a money trail.
Sure. You have to have evidence.
Evidence, and then another piece of evidence is having victims come forth and testify.
Yeah.
But as I'm reading this, it's saying, when a victim wanted to leave or was non-compliant, Rodriguez resorted to violent methods and claimed it was useless to try to get help due to his connections. And so there are a lot of women that are rightfully scared to come forward.
Sure.
Because of threats to their families. Like, these women have families in Colombia.
Yeah.
And who knows, it says one person, but surely one person cannot operate an international sex trafficking ring. There has to be multiple people involved. And so that's a real danger for women in, cantinas, strip club, even on the street is, if you do go to law enforcement, you could end up dead or beaten.
Well, yeah, and we know that, like, in certain cases, and probably in this one, right? Like, those who are being exploited, maybe they're not coming forward because they do still believe that he was legitimate law enforcement. And if a cop would do what he did, then you can't trust any of them, right?
Yeah.
I mean, how can you tell the difference between who's who? And, especially if you don't speak the language, you can't, you're not reading badge numbers and jurisdictions and things like that, right? So you don't know who to come forward to. And even if you did, you feel like you can't trust the people who are in power because they're the ones who've exploited you.
Yeah, and a lot of times they don't use the term trafficking.
Well, there's that too, right?
Many of the women I talked to in a cantina, like, they would never consider themselves trafficked.
Yeah, they don't. Yeah, that's not.
They just think they made a bad decision and that this is their fault.
Yeah,
and now they're stuck and they just have to, deal with the consequences.
Yeah.
But that's a whole nother work of helping people self-identify with trafficking, like, especially when it's manipulation. A lot of times people don't even know when they're being manipulated.
Right.
It can be that powerful over a person.
Yes. Again, to this case in particular, right? I mean, you could see where someone who was victimized by this individual, they might have thought that what they were doing was totally legitimate. They did get him to smuggle them across the border, or I don't know exactly how he facilitated that, right? But, he forced them into this debt bondage contract, and maybe they thought it was perfectly appropriate to be paying $250 a week because they're in the United States now. I mean, again, I don't know. I'm kind of theorizing. But
and if there is a contract, and you signed it.
I guess you've signed it now. Yeah.
What did the contract say? It could have had nothing to do with trafficking, but all of a sudden now you have this debt that you've agreed to, you could have been forcibly agreed to sign this thing. So that's another form of leverage that traffickers hold over these people. And, this is something that is common, especially in like IMBs, cantinas.
Yeah.
A lot of times we think of strip clubs as, above board, just kind of like normal part of a city. All cities have, major cities have strip clubs.
Sure.
But in this particular case, this strip club is kind of operating like a brothel.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's something that we'll see even more of because, like Houston, there's over 300 brothels. And so if you're in a sexually oriented business, there's obviously competition. And so how can you continue to just provide one service where all these different places are popping up, and unfortunately, that's created this sort of criminal industry.
Yeah, and that goes back to something you said on the first half of the episode is like, we're the market.
Yeah.
Like, we are the demand side. And for all the immigration conversations and, the smuggling stuff, it's like, well, as long as there's a demand, there will be a supply. So as we've thought through both of these two cases, I guess kind of the final question I want to land on with you is how can everyday citizens, how can people watching, us and listening to us right now help, right? Like how can they help? What action can they take? And what does it mean to be a more informed citizen in maybe like the quote unquote right way?
Yeah. I think what most people do is we read the headline, 54 people arrested in a trafficking sting, and, we share that.
Yeah.
Because it's a high number.
Yeah.
Or because it's in our neighborhood.
Yeah.
Or because it's by where we live.
Or, or it's like, oh man, that's terrible. I need other people to know that's terrible. Or maybe you're feeling like we need to prove that trafficking is real, so share this headline because it proves that trafficking is real.
Yeah.
But then that's it.
Yeah, and it doesn't go anywhere from there. But to really care about our community, I think we need to, these are all posted online. Anyone can go and read what we're sharing with you today. This isn't like our expert opinion. This is something that was written out, posted online, and we can read it, we can learn from it, and we can now begin to educate people in our circles. Begin to be more vocal about this, understanding that the more and more people know that this is happening, maybe eventually as a city we'll say, hey, this is something that shouldn't exist.
Yeah.
And we have to do something about it.
Right.
And make that switch in our minds to say, this isn't happening somewhere else. This isn't happening amongst, just elite people where Jeffrey Epstein's and all those, this is happening in our community, in our city, down the street from where some people live.
Yeah.
And it's our duty to learn. We have to learn. Otherwise, these criminals will begin to continue to innovate, continue to operate unchallenged, with no one knowing what's going on in these places. And we just stay in our bubbles. And, it's not good to stay in your bubble. It's good to get out of that bubble and look at someone else's suffering and begin to just listen, even just learn. That will compel you to want to bring more awareness to shine a light on it.
Yeah.
And so I think if we read these, stories and news articles and just become more informed and aware that this is happening, and not write it off as or share it just to receive some sort of notoriety.
Right.
You're in the know or whatever.
Look, I care.
Yeah, but do it in a way where you become educated.
Yeah.
That way, in future years, we can say no, we recognize what that is, and that's not going to happen anymore.
Yeah, that's so good. That's good. Yeah. So maybe we'll close with let's say somebody has heard your call to action just now. What does Elijah Rising do that might give them an on-ramp to not just be that informed citizen, but take the next step? Maybe we'll close like that.
Yeah. Well, I think listening to this podcast, this is something
subscribe.
we want to start doing regularly.
Yeah.
Not just talking about just nonprofit stuff or the way that we organize our, way we operate programs, and stuff like that. We really want to help bring insight to you guys by bringing real news, real stuff that's happening in Houston and in other areas for sure. So the Elijah Rising podcast is a great way to start. The second thing you could do is you can maybe set up a Google alert that says, you can type in Houston sex trafficking. Every time there's a trafficking event that happens, you're going to get an email with that story. Yeah. And, begin to read those. Yeah. And just become do some work on your own to become educated and to learn. And then the other thing is word of mouth. Tell 5 people, tell 10 people. Yeah. We have to continually talk about it. The more that we say that, this is the way it's going to be and this is the way it's always been, Houston is just always going to be a place where women are trafficked and brothels are on every corner. That's not something that we should be okay with. It shouldn't be something that sits with us. So we need to, get involved, volunteer with Elijah Rising. Like I said, we took people on van tours and showed them
these locations.
Chicas Locas was right by our old office.
Right. Yeah. Down the street from us. Yeah.
And all it takes is, the right people to get upset and begin to do something and make some moves.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, and you can also become a monthly donor of Elijah Rising. You can support this work. David said something a second ago. I can't remember what sparked the thought in my head, but one of the things we say often in our office, David and I sit right next to each other all day, is we hope that one day we don't have jobs. Like our goal is to work ourselves out of this job to where we don't need to do this anymore, and we go off into the sunset and do something different, right? Now we're not close to that day yet, but we're going to keep working towards it. But your monthly support makes that work possible and makes that goal and that dream a little bit closer. So we encourage you to become a monthly supporter of Elijah Rising and join, can I say it, the Rise community.
I would think it should be already out.
It's up and out now. So join the Rise community. Join a community of well-informed citizens that are taking a stand against sex trafficking and support the work of Elijah Rising. Come volunteer with us. Like and subscribe to this podcast.
Yeah.
And thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll see you on the next episode.
Thank you for joining us today for this episode. If you were inspired by this content today, please share, rate, and leave a review. Also, please consider making a donation at elijahrising.org/donate. Your support helps us continue the vital mission to combat sex trafficking. Until next time.